The cold wind howled through the empty streets as the city lights flickered in the distance. The night was unusually quiet, except for the occasional honk of a passing car. On a dimly lit sidewalk, surrounded by piles of discarded trash, sat a small boy, alone, shivering, and too weak to move. His clothes were tattered, barely enough to protect him from the biting cold, and his thin arms wrapped around his frail body. His legs, lifeless and unmoving, told a heartbreaking story, one of abandonment, struggle, and silent pain. Across the road, a sleek black car pulled to a stop at a red light. Inside, Alexander Carter, a self-made millionaire, leaned back in his seat, lost in thought. He had spent the last 15 years building an empire from nothing, yet tonight, something unsettled him. As he rubbed his temples, exhausted from another long business meeting, his gaze drifted outside. That's when he saw him, the boy, small and fragile, barely visible in the shadows. Something about the sight made Alexander's chest tighten. He had seen many struggling people in the city, but this was different. The child wasn't just homeless. He was abandoned, left to fend for himself in a world that had already turned its back on him. The light turned green, and the car inched forward, but Alexander couldn't look away. A strange feeling stirred inside him, something he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he gave a quick instruction to his driver. "Pull over," he said firmly. The driver hesitated. "Sir, this isn't a safe area." "Just do it." The car came to a slow stop near the sidewalk. Alexander stepped out, the cold wind hitting him instantly. He approached the boy cautiously, not wanting to startle him. Up close, the child looked even more fragile. His face was smudged with dirt, his lips pale from the cold. When he noticed Alexander, he flinched as if expecting harm. "Hey, kid," Alexander said softly. "Are you all right?" The boy didn't answer. His dark eyes were filled with fear and exhaustion. He tried to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. That's when Alexander realized the boy wasn't just sitting there. He had no choice. His legs weren't working. Alexander crouched down. "What's your name?" Still, no answer. The boy only stared, wary and unsure. Alexander sighed, glancing around. It was late. If he left now, the boy would spend another freezing night alone, and maybe he wouldn't survive it. "All right, listen," Alexander said. "I don't know what happened to you, but you can't stay here. Let me help you." The boy tensed, his thin fingers gripping the pavement, as if holding onto the only thing familiar to him. "I won't hurt you," Alexander reassured. "You don't have to trust me, but at least let me get you somewhere safe for the night." For a long moment, the boy didn't move. Then, as if deciding he had no other choice, he gave the faintest nod. Alexander carefully lifted him, surprised at how light he was. The boy didn't resist, though his body remained stiff. He carried him to the car, feeling the child tremble against him. As they drove away, Alexander stole a glance at the boy beside him. He sat quietly, his hands clenched in his lap, his gaze locked on the passing streets. He had the look of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Something about that broke Alexander's heart. "You can stay at my place for now," he said. "No pressure. Just until we figure something out." The boy didn't respond, but his eyes flickered toward him for a brief second before turning away again. Alexander didn't push. He knew trust wasn't earned overnight. He had no idea what had happened to this child. But one thing was certain. His life was about to change in ways neither of them could have imagined. And soon, so would Alexander's. The ride back to Alexander's mansion was silent, except for the occasional hum of the engine. The boy sat stiffly in his seat, staring at the road ahead. His small hands were balled into fists, his thin frame almost blending into the darkness. Alexander stole a few glances at him, wondering what kind of life had led him to that street. Abandoned and alone. He had so many questions, but he knew the boy wasn't ready to answer them yet. When they arrived at Alexander's estate, the grand iron gates swung open, revealing a massive house, lit up against the night sky. The boy's eyes flickered with something, maybe awe, maybe fear, but he quickly looked away, as if refusing to acknowledge it. Alexander stepped out and gently opened the car door for him. "Come on," he said. The boy hesitated, but eventually let Alexander help him out. As they entered the house, the warmth from inside washed over them. The boy, still wrapped in his thin, worn-out clothes, shivered slightly. A housekeeper, Maria, rushed toward them. "Sir, you're home late," she said. Then her gaze fell on the boy. Her eyes softened instantly. "Oh dear." Alexander turned to her. "Maria, could you get some warm clothes and a blanket?" "Of course," she said, hurrying off. The boy looked around cautiously, his fingers gripping the edge of his oversized shirt. The house was nothing like the streets he had known. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the giant paintings on the walls. It all seemed unreal. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Alexander motioned toward a couch. "You can sit." The boy hesitated, then slowly moved to the couch, his legs dragging behind him. The way he struggled made Alexander's heart tighten. He had never truly noticed how much people took simple movements for granted, until now. Maria returned with a bundle of clothes and a thick blanket. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said gently, placing them beside him. The boy didn't respond, just stared at them. Alexander sighed and sat across from him. "Listen, I don't know what happened to you, and I won't force you to tell me, but you're safe here. You can stay as long as you need." Still, the boy said nothing. Alexander ran a hand through his hair. He had built his entire life on logic and business strategies. But this was different. There was no deal to be made, no contract to sign, just a wounded child who refused to let anyone in. Maria spoke softly, breaking the silence. "Are you hungry, dear?" The boy hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Maria smiled warmly. "I'll bring something." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Alexander studied the child again. "Do you have a name?" he asked. The boy glanced at him, his lips parting slightly. Then after a long pause, he whispered, "Ethan." It was the first word he had spoken all night. Alexander felt something shift inside him. "Ethan," he repeated. "That's a good name." Ethan quickly looked away, as if regretting that he had spoken at all. Maria returned with a bowl of hot soup and placed it in front of him. The smell of warm broth filled the air, and for the first time, Ethan's guard cracked. His small hands trembled as he reached for the spoon. Alexander watched as he took slow, careful sips, his body still tense, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. As the days passed, Ethan remained quiet, but Alexander started noticing small changes. He ate regularly, let Maria help him dress, and even responded with small nods when spoken to. But he still flinched at loud noises. He still woke up in the middle of the night, eyes wide with fear, and he still never spoke about his past. One evening, as Alexander worked in his study, he heard a noise from Ethan's room. A muffled cry. He quickly walked over and pushed the door open. Ethan was sitting up in bed, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Tears streaked his face, and his small hands clutched the blanket tightly. Alexander stepped inside. "Ethan!" The boy didn't look at him. He was trapped in whatever nightmare had haunted him. Without thinking, Alexander sat beside him. "It's okay," he said softly. You're safe. Ethan's breathing slowed slightly, but he still didn't speak. Alexander hesitated before asking, Do you want to tell me what happened? For a long time, Ethan was silent. Then, in a barely audible voice, he said, They left me. Alexander's heart clenched. Who? Ethan swallowed hard. My parents. A heavy silence filled the room. Alexander had suspected it, but hearing it from the boy himself made it real. Ethan wiped his eyes, his voice shaky. They said I was broken. His gaze dropped to his useless legs. That I wasn't what they wanted. Alexander's fists clenched. He had met ruthless businessmen, people who would do anything for money, but nothing compared to this. To abandoning your own child, just because he wasn't what you expected. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Ethan, he said firmly, you're not broken. Ethan didn't respond, just stared down at his lap. Alexander continued. People who leave others behind. They're the ones who are broken, not you. Ethan looked up at him then, something unreadable in his eyes. And, for the first time, Alexander saw it, not just fear, but the smallest flicker of hope. But just as things started to settle, an unexpected event changed everything. One morning, as Alexander was finishing a business call, Maria rushed in, her face pale. Sir, she said urgently, there's someone at the door. They're asking about Ethan. Alexander's entire body tensed. Ethan's past had finally come knocking. Alexander felt a cold wave of tension wash over him. Someone was asking about Ethan. His grip on the phone tightened as he turned to Maria. Who is it? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Maria hesitated. A man and a woman. They say they're his parents. Alexander's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected this. Not after everything Ethan had told him. The thought of those people, the ones who had left their own child alone on the streets, now standing at his doorstep, made his blood boil. Ethan, he needed to protect him. Without another word, Alexander strode toward Ethan's room. The boy was sitting near the window, looking out at the garden, unaware of what was happening. When Alexander entered, Ethan glanced up, his face still holding that quiet, guarded expression. Hey, Alexander said gently. There's someone outside. They say they're your parents. Ethan froze. His small fingers tightened around the fabric of his sweater, and for a moment he didn't breathe. Then, in a whisper, he asked, They're here. Alexander nodded. You don't have to see them if you don't want to. Ethan swallowed hard. His eyes flickered with emotions, fear, confusion, and something deeper, something even he wasn't sure of. For so long, he had dreamed of them coming back, of them realizing their mistake. But now that they were here, it didn't feel right. I want to see them? Ethan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but I'll be with you. Downstairs, the front door opened, revealing a man and a woman in their mid-40s. They were dressed well, their faces carrying an expression of forced concern. Ethan stayed close to Alexander, his small frame rigid. Ethan, the woman gasped, taking a step forward. Oh, my baby. Ethan flinched at the word. She hadn't called him that the night they left him. The man beside her cleared his throat. We've been looking for you, he said. We made a mistake. Alexander's eyes darkened. A mistake? His voice was controlled, but the anger underneath was unmistakable. You abandoned your son on the streets. The woman's face twisted with guilt. We didn't know what to do, she insisted. His condition. It was too much for us. We weren't prepared. Ethan stayed silent, his head slightly lowered. Alexander's patience snapped. So, instead of finding help, you left him to die. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air. The man stiffened. We were scared, but we've changed. We want to make it right. Ethan finally looked up. His voice was quiet, but his words cut deeper than any argument. You didn't come back for me, he said. I waited. His hands clenched at his sides. I waited so long. The woman's face crumpled. Ethan, please, we love you. Ethan's lips trembled. He wanted to believe them. He had wanted this moment for so long, but something inside him had already broken beyond repair. You love me now? He asked. When I was alone, you weren't there. When I had nowhere to sleep, you weren't there. When I cried for you, you weren't there. His voice wavered, but his eyes stayed locked on theirs. The silence that followed was heavy. The truth lay between them, impossible to ignore. The man exhaled sharply, glancing at Alexander. He's not your son, he said coldly. You have no right to keep him. Alexander's expression remained unreadable. I don't need a right, he said simply. Ethan gets to decide. The couple turned to Ethan, desperation flickering in their eyes. Come home with us, his mother pleaded. Let's be a family again. Ethan stared at them, and for the first time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel like a helpless child, begging for love. He felt free. No, he said. His voice was quiet but firm. My home is here, his mother gasped. His father's face tightened. Ethan, no. Ethan repeated, looking at them with finality. I don't need you anymore. The words echoed in the grand hallway, closing a chapter that had long been left open. The couple stood there for a moment, realizing the truth. Their son, the boy they had once left behind, was no longer theirs. Alexander stepped forward. I think it's time for you to leave. With nothing left to say, the couple turned and walked out the door. As it shut behind them, Ethan let out a shaky breath. His hands were trembling, but there was something else in his eyes. Relief. Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. You okay? Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, he whispered. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The pain of his past hadn't vanished, but for the first time, it didn't define him. Downstairs, Alexander sat by the fireplace, thinking about everything that had happened. He had taken Ethan in on impulse, but somewhere along the way, the boy had become family, and maybe, just maybe, he had saved Alexander too.